Welcome to Graeme Codrington's Future of Work podcast. I'm Graeme, and what I really aim to do with this podcast is to provide insights into how the world is changing around us and look for practical resources that I can share with you that will help you make the future of work a reality today. And I think this requires us to upgrade our thinking, to unlearn some of our habits and things we've done in the past, to relearn new approaches, to reimagine what the world of work could be. So thank you for joining me. This is episode 6. And the previous 5 episodes, we've been a little bit spotty here and there. We were experimenting with different formats. And I'm really excited to say that now we have settled down as a team and we have agreed that the Future of Work podcast really does need to be a weekly event. And so from now, you're going to get me in your ear every week. Just make sure that you subscribe to the podcast on whatever your favorite podcast platform is. And once a week, we're going to aim at about 20 minutes. Keep it short and sharp and give you something to think about and something that you can apply and use immediately. As I said, this is technically episode 6. And I've entitled it, What I Learned from Google Headquarters About Building Belonging in Teams. A bit of a mouthful, but let me explain. I first visited Google headquarters in California a number of years ago as part of a leadership development program, and we got the grand tour. The client I was working with was one of Google's top clients, and so they rolled out the red carpet for us. And as we wandered around that sprawling campus, if you haven't been there, I'm sure you've seen pictures or know the legends. Everything from beach volleyball courts and people riding between the buildings on bicycles, and it's everything you've seen in the movies and heard in the legends. It was wonderful to visit. But one building that I passed, and I've lost the photograph I took of this, so I'm going by memory here, but I think it was called Building 23. It was off to the back of the campus and was a small 2-story building. And outside was a sign which said, Google Department for World Peace. I turned to the person that was taking us on a walk around, our guide, and I said, is that, are you aiming at humor with that? Is that a joke? And in all seriousness, she looked at me and she said, no. She said that Google's goal is to use data, and especially data analytics, to improve every aspect of life on Earth. And yes, it's obviously a little bit hyperbolic. It's a little bit inspirational and aspirational to say, let's have a department for world peace. But it proves an intent. Now, this was nearly a decade ago. I wonder how they are doing with that and how they're doing with some of their other massive ambitions. But it was about at this time, in 2012, that Google began a project they labeled Project Aristotle. And Aristotle, I suppose, emerged out of exactly this mindset that Google had, that using data and using data analytics, they could focus their attention on pretty much any topic on the planet and at least come up with some tentative solutions and answers, point people in the direction that the data was pointing them. And preferably, I suppose, open source that so that other people could build on that. At its heart, essentially, at least Google started at its heart, being a company that was about gathering, analyzing, making sense of, and sharing all of the information on the planet. I think some of that DNA is still there, although I think the accountants and salespeople might have got a little bit more involved in the last decade. But Project Aristotle was specifically focused on studying what makes teams work, what makes teamwork work, and especially what makes some teams work and others fail, or, as I think the Google team more poetically put it, what makes some teams soar and some teams stumble. Project Aristotle's researchers began by reviewing actually half a century's worth of academic studies on how teams worked. This is part of the project of bringing all research, all books, and digitizing them and putting them in a searchable and cross-referenceable database, and then throwing some AI algorithms at it. What they were hoping to find is they were looking for a formula for great teams. And you could get a list of things that you could do, and then bang, your team would be great. And based on the initial studies that they did of all of the sort of past research, so sort of doing a meta study, if you like, the researchers looked at how groups were put together, what groups did in terms of their activities, how groups had connections outside of them, demographic information, time-based information. And then they took all of this and applied it to about 160 or so teams that were working at Google, and did a whole lot of other research. So they had a mountain of data, probably more data than anybody else had. But after a few months, they hit up against a problem. No matter what they did with the data, no matter how they arranged it and cross-referenced it and did whatever they needed to do to it, they could not find patterns. It just seemed impossible to find patterns. There was no evidence that said that there was one particular way to manage a team that made it successful. So they had to look at the data in a very different way. And not just look at what each individual team was doing, but try and get inside the teams and the perceptions, even the self-perceptions that the team had of themselves. And this is where they struck gold. Because what they discovered was that when teams had a shared view of how the team should work, that team seemed to do better than a team that didn't have that view. So if there was a sense that the team understood how it should behave, that there was some sense of the rules, even if those rules were unwritten rules, but they were norms and established ways of behaving in the group. And when you could actually see that whatever the individual's preferences were, that when they got into a group environment, the group's norms would override those individual preferences and approaches. And that people they adjusted themselves, if you like, to the expectations that the teams had. That was the strongest correlation to success. Now, that didn't mean that there was one particular set of norms or behaviors or rules that every team followed. Some teams had leaders who were reasonably directive and told them what to do. Others had very, very democratic teams that just allowed people to make their own decisions. Some teams ran meetings that were very, very tight ships. Everybody was very, very focused in and out of the meeting, get going. Other teams had meetings that went on for ages and everybody could just talk and nobody was stopped in their talking. So there was no sense that there was a particular set of behaviors that was valid for all groups, except that the groups knew what the behaviors were. They knew what was expected of them. And this became a clear pattern that they were then able to see over and over again. It wasn't so much which norms a team had, but rather whether the majority of team members recognized and were comfortable with the norms. Better performing teams were clearer about how the team worked. The actual norms were less important than the fact that the group recognized and adhered to the norms that the group had accepted. So this opened up a very different way of looking at the data for the Project Aristotle researchers. And they noticed that there were a few key behaviors that good teams generally shared. So looking then through a different lens, they were able to identify some things that we can now copy and that we can now learn from. Probably top of the list was that good teams all seem to be made up of individuals who had high, what they called social sensitivity. This is a fancy way of saying that they were skilled at working out how others felt based on the tone of voice or their expressions, or that there was an intuition almost about how other people on the team were experiencing their day or their life. They didn't need to be told that somebody on their team was having a bad time. They were able to work it out. They seemed to know when somebody was feeling upset or left out. People on ineffective teams, by contrast, seemed to have less sensitivity towards their colleagues. Or even if individuals in the team picked up some of that sensitivity towards others, they didn't do anything about it. So the first thing was what they called average social sensitivity in the teams. We might call that empathy or emotional intelligence even, I suppose. The second thing that they noticed is that on good teams, members actually contributed, and by contributed they meant actually spoke up in roughly the same proportion. Everybody not only felt that they had a voice, but that they also were allowed, invited, and to think it was even more than that, encouraged, maybe even pushed a little bit to contribute. Everybody got a chance to talk. Everybody got a chance to contribute, and their contributions were welcomed and invited, and even, is this the right word, extracted from them. I mean that in a positive sense, of course. And what they then reverse engineered, what they discovered, sort of looking backwards at this, was that these two behaviors are what psychologists call the foundations of psychological safety. And this was the key that unlocked the Project Aristotle work. And I think a lot of companies, a lot of leaders, a lot of teams over the last decade have started to use this phrase, maybe not necessarily recognizing or knowing where it came from. But psychological safety is key to successful teams. It's the ability to know that I can be me here. That I can contribute here, that people have got my back around here, that if I have a bad day, people will understand, that going back to the first thing I said, that I can be me. This is not about work-life integration, but it's about realizing that nobody can really separate out what's happening in their life, with their friends, their close friends and family, and what's happening in their own body with their health and their psychological and mental and physical and spiritual wellness. You cannot actually just leave that at home. That's the language that maybe some managers have used in the past. You bring all of that with you. You can mask it, but the more you have to mask those sort of things while you're working with your teammates at work, the less you're connecting, the less you're engaging, the less you are feeling part of that group. The main building blocks of psychological safety are connection, communication, and empathy. Let me say that again, and that comes from the Project Aristotle work. It's connection, communication, and empathy. We'll come back to these in a lot more detail over the next few episodes. As we unpack what we at our team at Tomorrow Today have discovered from a variety of pieces of research are the key ingredients to developing teams. We connect with these three from Project Aristotle very definitely. Connection, communication, and empathy, absolutely vital. Establishing psychological safety is, however, a messy thing to do. It's difficult to implement. I can't just give you those three words and then say, excellent, now you know what to do, off you go. Be more connected, communicate more, be more empathetic. Excellent, well done. You can tell people to take turns during a conversation and to listen to each other more. You can instruct your employees, your colleagues, to be more sensitive to how each other feels on the team. And you can send a memo to make sure that everybody is a little bit more open to thinking about others and noticing when somebody else seems upset. But you've got no guarantee that other people will respond in the same ways that you would or that anybody else on the team would. I mean, we've all been on some teams that have left us feeling totally exhausted. This is probably the reason why, by the way, and totally drained when we engage with the team. And I hope that we've been on teams where we get so much energy from the group that we just can't wait for the next time that we engage with our colleagues. We all know which teams we'd prefer to be on, right? So this is what we need to be working on, is building this sense of psychological safety and unpacking what that means and what that looks like. And so that's what we're going to do over the next few episodes of this podcast. Let me leave you with this thought as I just set this up, and I'll be back in your ear next week with some more details. And we'll look next week at 9 key steps to building a sense of belonging in our remote teams in particular. But let me leave you with this thought this week. In an office environment, when we're all in a physical space, communication and connection, at least, are a lot easier to do. Empathy might flow from that, but at least communication and connection are a lot easier to do because you are literally and physically in the same space. People all arrive at that space, together. And that's why we all got into rush hour traffic before COVID, because we all needed to get to the office at roughly the same time and stay there for roughly the same length of time. And I like to kind of think of it as actually being a very inefficient app. If you think of the Office as an app that was loaded on your smart device, that you kind of had to check into at 8 o'clock in the morning and had to stay connected with until 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, communication would happen, of course, if you had to constantly be connected to that app. Then people who needed to send you a message could just send you a message. Walk over to your desk and speak to you, and your boss could look out of her window down the open plan corridor, or through a door down the open plan corridor, and see that everybody was at their desks banging away at their keyboards, and she could say to herself, "Yeah, everybody's here, everybody's working hard." And it's actually a remarkably inefficient app, because we think we've connected because we've simply inhabited the same physical space for a number of hours, a few days in a row. But have we actually connected? Yes, you could see maybe that somebody's sitting at their desk with a tear in their eye, or maybe they don't bound into the office with the normal energy they have. So you kind of naturally walk across and ask, "Are you okay? And is everything okay?" So it's not totally ineffective. Being in the same physical space as people certainly does enable, it helps you to communicate and connect. But I think that those teams that have been struggling during COVID lockdown and been separated, those that have been struggling the most, are those that didn't actually properly communicate and connect while they were in the office. They relied on just the physical proximity to give them an approximation of human connection. What we need to do in a virtual space is be a lot more intentional about making those connections, to deliberately decide as a team on what good communication looks like for our team. Remember, there isn't an answer to that question that's a one-size-fits-all answer. Different teams communicate in different ways, but the best teams all agree on what is good communication for us. And so you have to have that conversation as a team. Then we can say the same with connection. Not every team knows everything about every other member of the team, although every good team does have some human connection with the other people. And we'll talk about that in the next episode. But what every good team has is some level of norms, some level of accepted connection that the whole team understands. And this is set by the leader from the top, right? In a sense of how are we connected to each other? What level of vulnerability and openness do we have? Not too much, not too little, just enough. And what does that mean for our team? And how are we having that conversation? It's a conversation we need to have. And that then leads to the empathy piece as well. How much connection and empathy do we want for each other? In what ways do we show care for each other? In what ways do we rely on the team to show us care when we need it the most? If we get those things right, communication, connection, and empathy, we will be well on our way to providing psychological safety and to building what we at Tomorrow Today call belonging in your team, a sense of belonging, that I'm part of this team, this group, this tribe, this family, whatever the language is that is best for you and your team. Project Aristotle is a reminder that when companies try to optimize everything, it's easy to forget that success is often built on experiences, emotional interactions, complicated conversations, discussions of who you are, who you want to be, of how our teammates make us feel. These can't really be optimized. Project Aristotle, based on all the data in the world, best research probably ever done into how teams work, indicate that the foundation, the very basis of brilliant teams, of teams that succeed, is not something that you can optimize with algorithms or simple formulas. It's based on decidedly human factors: communication, connection, engagement. Communication, connection, and empathy. Communication, connection, humanity. The good news is that if that's not how it feels to be part of your team now, it's not too late. You can start. And you can start doing it before you get back to the office. So here's your thought as we finish out this episode. You're not going to solve your belonging problem. You're not going to solve your connection, communication, and empathy issues by simply getting everybody back to the office. If it's not feeling great to be in a virtual environment, it's probably because you didn't have a solid basis of connection, communication, and empathy. And what working remotely has done is it's merely exposed that to the light. It isn't the problem. Teams that work remotely, virtually, in a hybrid way can be brilliantly connected, communicate spectacularly well, and have great empathy and concern and compassion for each other, and can work spectacularly well. So it's not that's the root problem. You've got to start changing the norms, changing, let me use the word, culture of your team. And you don't have to wait until you get back to the office to do that. So what do you actually have to do? Well, I'm sorry, but I'm going to leave you in a little bit of suspense because our time is up, and we're going to come back to this in the next episode, where I suggest that there are 9 steps to creating a sense of belonging. So make sure that you subscribe to Graeme Codrington's Future of Work podcast so that you don't miss any of the new episodes, and certainly don't miss the next one, which is going to start moving you towards what you can actually do. Please share these thoughts with your team. Share this podcast with colleagues and friends that you think would find it useful. And please connect with me at my website, graemecodrington.com. Go and have a look at some of the resources that are available there. And if I can help you right now, working with your team and building and improving the team culture that you have, especially in a remote environment, well, please contact me. You can do that via the website graemecodrington.com. I'll chat to you next week as we keep on this journey towards the future of work.